had spent 17 years building a system no one else believed in. When I joined Linares Health, it was still a scrappy regional pharmaceutical company, barely clinging to relevance. They had one aging diabetes drug and a licensing deal in litigation. No one was paying attention to them, and frankly, they didn't deserve much attention. But I saw a skeleton worth building muscle on. I wasn't flashy or loud. I didn't pitch big dreams. I pitched frameworks, boring, resilient, and quietly transformative. Over the next decade, we expanded into hypertension therapies, negotiated exclusive hospital contracts, and created a pipeline of generics that shaved millions off competitor profits. I didn't do it alone, but I designed the engine and kept it running. I was the engine. I wasn't the face of the company. That was always someone younger, sleeker, more media-ready. But behind the headlines and press releases, I was the one building infrastructure, untangling licensing knots, and building our predictive R&D pipeline. I didn't care for attention. I cared for precision. That's what kept us afloat when COVID hit. While competitors scrambled, we restructured production in under 6 weeks and doubled fulfillment. The board said I'd saved the company. Our CEO at the time, Marcus Allen, once told me, "Elaine, you're not loud, but if you ever left, the silence would be deafening." Then came the acquisition. VentureCore Capital bought us out in Q3 last year. The deal was aggressive and came with strings. Within a month, Marcus retired. A week later, we had a new CEO, Ashley Brooks. She was 33, ex-Tesla innovation lead with a trail of failed startups behind her and a cult of personality strong enough to make the board ignore all that. Her first week at Linares, she put up posters in the office saying, "Legacy is a liability." I knew what that meant. She brought in consultants who talked more about brand narrative than clinical compliance. The tone shifted quickly. Suddenly, we were expected to simplify strategy decks for investors who didn't have time for data. They stopped asking for my models. The strategy I'd spent years refining was quietly shelved in favor of aggressive expansion plans that weren't even compliant in half the states we operated in. Meetings I was once central to were now Ashley only. The signs were there. Cut off email threads, backdoor decisions, misattributed project credits. I watched them roll out changes to my clinical efficacy dashboards and rebrand them as agile insight layers. They didn't even understand how the models worked. I started getting looped in only when there was a problem no one else could fix. I stayed professional. I never snapped, never raised my voice, never made demands, but I watched. And I noted everything. People stopped meeting my eye in the hallways. New hires didn't know my name. And then came the board meeting invite. Just a light strategy alignment, they said. The agenda was vague. The invite list suspiciously short. I told my assistant Rachel to cancel my afternoon. I had a feeling. The conference room smelled like citrus-scented polish and tension. It was one of those modern glass-walled spaces meant to signal transparency while actually being designed to isolate and expose. When I walked in, Ashley was already seated at the head of the table, legs crossed casually, as if this were just another Thursday sync. 3 board members were on the screen, the others in the room, each with a company-issued notepad and faux pleasant smile. Rachel wasn't invited, no one from my team was, it was just me. "Elaine," Ashley smiled too wide, "thanks for joining us. We just wanted to have a quick chat about strategic vision." Her voice had that performative warmth that always preceded a blade. I nodded and took my seat, silently noting who wouldn't meet my eyes. Then came the phrasing, too rehearsed to be spontaneous. "As you know, we're pushing to be faster, leaner, more aligned with next-gen market expectations. The board's really excited about that direction." I waited. I've sat through 1,000 of these setups. They always start with buzzwords and fake enthusiasm before they drop the real line. Ashley didn't disappoint. "We think your contributions have been invaluable," she said, emphasizing the past tense just enough. "But we're at an inflection point, and frankly, the skills that got us here aren't the same ones we need to take us forward." A pause, then that infuriating tilt of the head. "It's not about fault, it's about fit." There was. "We're offering you a transition package," one of the board members chimed in, his tone dry and transactional. 6 months severance, a consultant title for resume continuity, and a quiet exit. We'd like to position it as a natural evolution for all parties. I didn't flinch. That alone seemed to throw them off. No one in that room expected me to stay silent. I looked at Ashley. "You're saying I'm being let go?" She hesitated, then softened her expression. "I'm saying your role no longer aligns with the company's strategic trajectory. We want to honor your legacy, Elaine." My legacy, like I was a dusty portrait being moved to the storage room. Another board member leaned forward, speaking as if I needed help understanding. "There's no shame in it. Things are changing. Ashley is leading us into a new era." It took everything in me not to laugh. The woman hadn't been with us for 6 months and had already burned through 3 project teams and a third of our data budget. But I said nothing. My silence was sharper than any reply. They slid the envelope across the table like it was a peace offering. Inside, I knew, would be the NDA, the standard exit verbiage, and the list of HR talking points. I didn't touch it. "Will there be a statement?" I asked, still calm. Ashley nodded. "We've drafted one. It highlights your contributions, positions this as a graceful handoff. We'd like to release it Friday." I smiled, just enough to unnerve. "Then you have your answer by Thursday." Ashley blinked. "I'm sorry? I'll review everything and get back to you by Thursday," I repeated. "I don't do rushed decisions. You should know that by now." She tried to recover, but the room had already shifted. They thought they were pushing me off a cliff. They didn't realize I'd already built the parachute. I stood, slowly, deliberately, and offered my hand to Ashley. She took it, out of habit more than respect. "Good luck," I said. As I turned to leave, I caught the reflection of my own face in the glass wall. I didn't look defeated. I looked like someone who had just confirmed what she already knew. They'd made a mistake. In the hallway, Rachel was waiting. She looked anxious, as if she'd been pacing the entire time. "What happened?" I paused, adjusted the strap on my bag, and gave her a measured look. "They think I'm dead weight," I said. "Let's see how far they get without the ballast." We walked in silence to the elevator. I didn't need to say more. She knew. Everyone who'd paid attention in the last few months knew this was coming. What they didn't know was what I had been doing in the background, while Ashley curated hashtags and headline quotes. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I poured a glass of wine, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the drawer where I kept everything I wasn't ready to use. Yeah. Inside was a binder labeled Whitaker Consulting Draft. The tabs were still crisp. Business structure, initial client list, systems architecture, a list of names I'd marked over the past 2 years, people who respected strategy over sparkle. I took a sip of wine, pulled the binder closer, and opened a new document on my laptop. They wanted faster. I'd show them what fast actually looked like. It's strange how quickly the mind adjusts when dignity is all you have left. The morning after the boardroom ambush, I woke up without the weight of urgency I'd carried for over a decade. No dashboards to check, no morning syncs to prepare, no second-guessing how to navigate the politics of Ashley's new regime. I made coffee slowly, deliberately. For the first time in years, I didn't read market reports with breakfast. Instead, I reread the transition package. It was almost insulting in its predictability. Legalese sprinkled with platitudes as if polishing the language made the betrayal easier to swallow. I signed nothing, not yet. That day, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened the long-forgotten Dropbox folder labeled Whitaker Holdings. 3 years ago, during a stretch of particularly frustrating leadership changes, I'd started sketching out a contingency, my version of an emergency exit hatch. It wasn't a revenge plan. It was self-respect insurance. I registered a limited liability company, hired a freelance designer to create a placeholder logo, jotted down possible services I could offer, operational restructuring, market entry strategy, crisis optimization. The idea back then had seemed more like a private fantasy than a real path, but now, looking at it, it felt less like backup and more like blueprint. By mid-afternoon, I had already called Alan Stern. Alan had been our liaison on a multi-hospital procurement deal 2 years ago. He was now VP of Strategic Partnerships at a healthcare startup that had just closed a $90 million 0 cents Series C. He picked up immediately. "Elaine? Wow! Didn't expect to hear from you. What's going on?" I gave him the headline version, no bitterness, just facts. Lunaris is going in a new direction. I'm exploring next chapters. He didn't hesitate. You'd be a huge asset. Want to grab lunch this week? There was no need for flattery. Professionals recognize signal through noise. We set a meeting for Thursday. After the call, I opened a fresh document. At the top, I typed, Phase 1, Activation. The steps were clear in my mind. Register a proper consulting domain. Reconnect with 5 key executives I'd worked with over the last decade. People who trusted strategy over slogans. Draft a positioning statement that wasn't vague, fluffy, or chasing trends. I wasn't going to pretend to be a brand guru or an agile mindset transformer. I was going to be exactly what I'd always been, the person companies called when everything was broken and they needed someone who didn't panic. That evening, I called Rachel. I didn't ask for her help. I offered her a choice. I know your role at Lunaris is tied to mine, I said. I'm building something, but it's early. If you want to stay where it's stable, I understand completely. She didn't miss a beat. Stable is a myth. I'm in. Loyalty like that doesn't come from charisma or friendship. It comes from years of being in the trenches together and knowing who always showed up. On Friday morning, just before the board's statement about my graceful departure was due to go out, I sent Ashley a brief email. No statement necessary. I've decided to move forward independently. Thank you for the clarity. That was it. No bitterness, no legal threats. I knew they wanted me quiet. What they didn't realize was that silence and submission are not the same thing. Later that day, I published a post on LinkedIn. It read, After 17 years building systems that supported growth through precision, I'm starting a new chapter. Whitaker Consulting will focus on helping emerging and established healthcare firms solve operational complexity with strategic clarity. I didn't mention Lunaris. I didn't need to. Within 2 hours, it had over 800 likes and dozens of messages. 4 executives reached out directly. 2 of them had already spoken with Ashley in recent months and apparently walked away unimpressed. I didn't allow myself to feel triumphant. Not yet. I knew how quickly buzz could fade. What mattered now was execution. I blocked off the next 72 hours for silence and building. I mapped out service offerings, wrote a 1-page brochure, contacted a developer to help polish the website. I wasn't trying to look trendy. I wanted it clean, clear, and authoritative. That Sunday night, as I reviewed my plan, I found myself staring at a name I'd scribbled months ago. CorePath Diagnostics. They were in a tricky place mid-merger and needed operational leadership. I had helped them navigate a compliance scare 2 years prior, and their CEO, Vanessa Ford, had sent me a handwritten thank you note that still sat in my drawer. I drafted a short message, Vanessa, I'm building something new. If your team still needs structural guidance during the integration, I'd love to talk. I didn't send it yet. Not that night. I wasn't desperate. I was deliberate. Let Ashley flood the feed with photos from her latest innovation summit. Let the board convince themselves they'd cut loose a liability. I wasn't going to tell them otherwise. I was going to let the market do that for me, quietly, surgically, and without ever raising my voice. The first official week of Whitaker Consulting didn't begin with a ribbon cutting or a press release. It began with silence, intentional, weighted silence. I didn't need noise, I needed precision. On Monday morning, I finalized the LLC documentation through my attorney and submitted the EIN request. By noon, my new domain, whitakerstrategy.com, was live, stripped down but clean, bearing a single message on its homepage. Strategy isn't theory, it's infrastructure. No rotating taglines, no pastel infographics, no jargon-filled nonsense. Just clarity. I wasn't competing with flashy incubators or branding firms. I was offering something rarer, operational intelligence with actual teeth. Within 48 hours of my LinkedIn post, the signal had traveled. 2 of the executives who reached out requested immediate consults. One was head of operations at a national network of urgent care centers. They were scaling too fast and hemorrhaging efficiency. The second was an investor-backed telehealth startup expanding into elder care, and they had no post-launch playbook. Both knew me from projects I'd overseen while at Lunaris. They trusted not just my work, but how I worked, discreetly, fast, and without fluff. I took both meetings over Zoom and closed both contracts within the week. Meanwhile, I reached out to Vanessa Ford at CorePath, The message I'd drafted days earlier had sat in my inbox unsent until Wednesday. I waited on purpose. I didn't want to appear opportunistic. When I finally hit send, her reply came within hours. "Your timing is eerie. I was just about to call you. Can you come in Friday?" I hadn't even needed to pitch. CorePath's merger had hit friction. Their CTO had left abruptly, and integration between systems stalled due to incompatibility across diagnostic software. In other words, chaos. Vanessa had brought in a few outside voices, but as she confessed during our meeting, none of them understand scale like you do. They keep trying to fix things with slide decks. I reviewed their architecture over the weekend and gave her a diagnostic map by Monday. No fluff, no 20-slide presentation, just 4 bullet points and 3 suggested structural pivots. By Tuesday, they asked me to come on for a 3-month consulting contract, paid monthly at a rate that exceeded what I used to make at Lunares in a quarter. There was a brief moment on the drive home from that meeting where I allowed myself a grin. Not smugness, certainty. I hadn't even launched publicly, I hadn't run a campaign or chased clients. I had simply said I was ready, and people who knew what value looked like came running. Around that same time, I received a text from Rachel. "Ashley launched a reorg today. Your old department's being split between 2 directors. Everyone's confused." It didn't surprise me. They never understood that my role wasn't a title, it was a structure. You can't split a foundation in 2 and expect the building to stand. By the end of week 2, the website had a refined interface, a 1-page service brief, and a lead generation form that filtered out vague inquiries. I didn't want everyone, I wanted the right ones. My content strategist, an old contact from a pharma think tank, helped me publish my first official piece, a short, incisive article titled "Speed Without Structure: Why Startups Collapse at Scale." Within 24 hours, it was reshared by over 100 professionals, including 3 current Lunaris employees. The title alone did more damage than any NDA breach ever could. On a Thursday afternoon, I got an email that gave me pause. It was from a vendor I used to collaborate with at Lunaris, an analytics firm that supported our R&D modeling. The message was brief. "Ashley's team reached out asking for your old performance matrices. We told them we can't replicate them without your sign-off. Just a heads up." I hadn't expected that. I had assumed they'd try to rebuild my tools or replace them with something shinier. I hadn't realized they were trying to copy them outright. It was flattering, if deeply incompetent. I replied politely, telling the vendor they were under no obligation to replicate proprietary methodology and suggesting they refer Ashley to the publicly available datasets. It was my way of drawing a line without drawing blood. The next morning, I received a LinkedIn message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Dr. Louise Bernard, former chief medical officer at a mid-sized clinical trial accelerator. She'd just joined a new health innovation incubator and said she'd read my article. "We're looking for someone who can bridge vision and infrastructure," she wrote. "Not many people can do both. Let's talk." I scheduled the meeting. By the close of the 3rd week, Whitaker Consulting was serving 3 active clients, negotiating a 4th, and operating entirely through word of mouth. I hadn't advertised once. Every lead came through someone who had once sat in a room with me, watched me dismantle a problem calmly, and remembered it. That was my brand. Then came the whisper. Rachel called me after hours one night. Her voice was hushed. "So I overheard something you love," she said. "Apparently the board asked Ashley about the drop in operational stability. Her response? We're rebalancing our strategy architecture." Rachel paused, which, translated from nonsense, means she has no idea what's going wrong. I didn't laugh, not out loud, but I did open a new document and began outlining a white paper I'd been thinking about. Its working title, "What Happens When You Remove the Wrong Variable." I wouldn't name names, I didn't have to. The industry was already doing that for me. By the beginning of the 2nd month, Whitaker Consulting was no longer a quiet experiment, it was a presence. Clients were talking to other clients. My name was showing up in meetings I wasn't attending, recommended by people I hadn't worked with in years. Not because of charm or branding, I had none of that. I didn't post morning mantras or photos from hotel lobbies. I posted frameworks. I shared real problems and how they were solved. The industry noticed. Real operators always do. Lunaris, meanwhile, was unraveling in slow motion. The cracks weren't loud or dramatic. They were systemic. I heard through one of my hospital contacts that they'd missed a delivery timeline on a critical hypertension medication for a second month in a row. Then another former colleague messaged me to say that Ashley had pulled a product launch forward by 6 weeks to impress investors, and now the compliance documentation was incomplete. A quiet internal audit had been triggered. No headlines yet, but pressure was building. At CorePath, my work was expanding beyond diagnostics integration. They asked me to sit in on strategy sessions for their next acquisition. I wasn't even officially on the executive team, but the CEO kept introducing me as our strategy architect. The trust was total. The pay was exceptional. The freedom was absolute. I began to delegate parts of my work, bringing in 2 vetted consultants to support the scaling. Whitaker Consulting was now more than me. It was an operation. Then came the RFP. A mid-sized national healthcare chain posted a request for proposals for a 3-year strategic transformation plan. The scope was enormous. 20-plus facilities, cross-departmental overhaul, multi-state compliance. It was the kind of contract that Lunaris would have chased aggressively just a year ago. I wasn't planning to apply. I didn't need the exposure, and I wasn't sure I wanted to take on something that large so soon. But then Rachel forwarded me an internal memo. It had been circulated inside Lunaris. Ashley had made the RFP a priority pursuit. The memo ended with this sentence: "We'll win this. There's no one out there who understands the scale like we do." I read it twice, then once more, slower. It wasn't arrogance that pushed me. It was the lie. The quiet, condescending assumption that nothing had changed, that the company still had the expertise they'd thrown away 2 months earlier. So I submitted. My proposal was 12 pages. No fluff, no vision statements, no vague deliverables. Just a method, week by week, phase by phase, outcome by outcome, every metric backed by experience, every risk acknowledged and mitigated. It wasn't flashy, it was real. I didn't expect to hear back quickly, but within a week, the client scheduled an interview. I sat across from their COO, a woman named Denise Chen, who had followed my work for years without my knowing. "Your plan is the first one we've read that doesn't treat transformation like a rebranding exercise," she said. "You actually understand how systems work, and you've already lived the mistakes we're trying to avoid." The next morning, they awarded me the contract. I didn't gloat, I didn't post about it, but I did call Rachel. "Lunaris didn't win the RFP," I said. "We did." Her silence said everything. Then came the quiet, disbelieving laugh. "You didn't even need to beat them," she said. "You just needed to exist." As the weeks passed, more calls came in. A biotech startup wanted guidance on scaling without burning out infrastructure. A medical AI firm needed to clean up their bloated operations before pitching Series B. A government public health division reached out, asking if I could help them modernize distribution. Each client came with the same question: "Can you help us move fast without falling apart?" And every time I said yes, because that's what I did. I didn't talk fast, I didn't pitch fast, I moved fast. Because I planned before anyone else even noticed there was a plan to be made. Around the same time, Ashley's team at Lunaris made a subtle shift. I noticed it first when a former Lunaris project lead, now freelancing, sent me a screenshot from a presentation Ashley had given at a virtual healthcare summit. The slide featured a strategic timeline, a cleaned-up version of one of my old internal models. They'd kept the structure but stripped the depth. It was like seeing a skeleton walk without muscle. The model was being used, but the people who built it were gone. Then something even stranger happened. I received a message from a Lunaris vendor asking if I would be willing to consult, quietly behind the scenes, on a project the company had been struggling with. It wasn't an official ask. It was a feeler. I declined, not because I couldn't do it, but because I wanted the silence around my absence to grow heavier. I wanted it to echo. I published another piece, This one titled The Cost of Cosmetic Change. It wasn't about Lunaris, but everyone who read it knew exactly who I was talking about. It was clinical, measured, and damning without ever saying a name. I wrote, when leadership prioritizes optics over structure, the decay is not immediate, it's incremental. But the collapse, when it comes, is absolute. The article spread like wildfire across healthcare strategy circles. A week later, I got a call from Denise Chen. Ashley's been asking questions, she said. Wants to know who helped us land on our strategic rollout. I told her it was a firm run by someone she might remember. I didn't ask for more, I didn't need to. I knew Ashley would see the name, I knew she'd put the pieces together. And I knew it was only a matter of time before she'd have to make a call she never imagined making. The message came through Rachel first, which already told me everything I needed to know. Ashley hadn't contacted me directly. She'd reached out through someone she considered peripheral, someone who might act as a buffer in case her request was met with silence. But Rachel wasn't a buffer. She was a bridge, and one I had built myself. She asked if you'd be willing to have a conversation. She didn't say what about, just that it was time-sensitive. That phrase was code for desperation. People like Ashley never admitted mistakes until the consequences started to eat into their numbers. She hadn't been humbled by reflection. She was being cornered by results. I waited 2 days before responding, not to be dramatic, just to be deliberate. Let her feel what it was like to need a reply and not be prioritized. When I finally agreed, I kept the meeting neutral. A quiet cafe near the water, not far from my office, where I could leave quickly if the conversation devolved into self-preservation theater. Ashley arrived early. She wore her usual monochrome blazer, designer tote, and a look that was carefully engineered to suggest calm control. But her eyes betrayed her. They moved too fast, scanning the cafe like she was still bracing for an ambush. I didn't offer a hug. I didn't offer small talk. I just nodded and sat down. Lane, she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, thanks for agreeing to meet. I said nothing, just waited. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. I'm sure you've heard things. I won't pretend everything's been seamless. I didn't respond, let the silence do the work. After a pause, she continued. Look, we moved fast. Probably too fast. Some of the systems you built, I underestimated how embedded they were. We thought we could replicate them, but we've run into obstacles. She exhaled. Significant ones. Still, I said nothing. She shifted in her chair. I'm asking if you'd consider consulting, short-term, just to help stabilize some of the areas you were responsible for. You know the infrastructure better than anyone. We're not asking you to come back, just assist for now. It was surreal watching her try to frame her request as anything other than a surrender. There was no longer a we in control. There was a company in crisis and a leader scrambling to patch holes she'd punched herself. I finally spoke. What happened to the new direction? She looked down. It lacked a map. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of her words settle. Then I asked, are you asking as the CEO of Lunaris or as Ashley Brooks? Her eyes flicked up. Does it matter? It does to me. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, softer, I'm asking as someone who knows she misjudged a situation, and as someone who's responsible for cleaning it up. There was no apology, but there was enough humility in her tone to register as real. I'll consult, I said, but on my terms. She straightened slightly, trying to recover some composure. Of course, let's discuss scope and... I stopped her with a glance. You won't draft the scope. I will. You won't route payment through internal teams. It'll be direct, contract-based, through Whitaker Consulting. No employee reinstatement. No internal email access. No branding alignment. I come in, fix what you broke, and leave. She nodded carefully. Understood. One more thing, I added. If I'm going to clean up your mess, I'm not walking into a room where the same voices that watched me walk out now pretend I never existed. I want full access to the board. Ashley's jaw tightened, but she didn't protest. Done. I stood, Send your pain points in bullet form by Monday. I'll respond if I find them solvable. The meeting ended there. No handshake, no attempt at closure. Back in my office, I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was precise, focused. This wasn't about revenge. This was about completing a cycle that had started the moment they called me dead weight in that boardroom. On Monday, the document arrived, titled simply, Operational Breakdown, Priority Zones. It was a mess. Broken processes, overlapping teams, compliance oversights, missed deadlines, all the things I had warned them about in my last year at Lunaris. They hadn't replaced me with innovation. They had replaced me with noise. I reviewed it line by line, highlighted what was fixable, deleted what wasn't worth salvaging. Then I created a 30-day contract, priced appropriately, and sent it with a note. Engagement will begin upon receipt of signed agreement, no revisions accepted. By Thursday, the signed contract was back in my inbox. The next month was clinical. I didn't take meetings in their offices. I didn't report to anyone. I worked independently, interfaced only with specific department heads, and made it clear that I was not there to mentor, only to repair. Within 2 weeks, delivery timelines stabilized. Within 4, vendor relationships that had gone cold were back in motion. I created a restructured model for their compliance pipeline and handed it off without ceremony. The board requested a meeting. I agreed, but only on the condition that it was a working session, not a performance. They gathered in the same glass-walled room where I had once been told, politely, that I no longer fit. This time, they listened. I presented a diagnostic summary. Not once did I mention who had created the chaos. Not once did I reference my exit. I spoke as if the data were neutral, because the truth didn't need drama to be damning. At the end of the session, one of the board members said, "We underestimated your role." I didn't respond. I just collected my papers, nodded, and left the room. As I stepped into the elevator, Ashley caught up. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside me, awkward in the silence. Finally, she said, "Thank you." I turned my head slightly. This was never about thanks. And with that, the doors closed. They hadn't brought me back. They had come back to me. 6 months later, I was sitting in the back row of a strategy symposium in New York, sipping coffee, watching a panel of executives debate future-proofing operations. Ashley Brooks was among them. Her tone was practiced, her phrases smoothed by repetition, her slides polished to a gleam. I didn't feel resentment. I didn't feel triumph. I felt distance. She was still playing the same game, optics, packaging, noise. I had simply stopped playing it with her. Whitaker Consulting had outgrown me. I now had a core team of 4 senior consultants, all hand-picked, all deeply competent. We didn't advertise, we didn't pitch, we didn't cold call. Clients came to us because they had heard what happened when we walked into a room and what happened when we left. Our average contract length had grown to 5 months. Our retention rate was over 90%. I didn't work weekends anymore. I chose who I answered. And most days, I turned off my phone before dinner. At a quarterly meeting with one of our largest clients, the CEO paused mid-sentence and said, "You know, I heard about what happened with Lunaris. If I were them, I'd be begging you to take over." I smiled politely and redirected the conversation. There was no need to correct him. The truth was, they already had. A week later, I received a LinkedIn message from a former intern at Lunaris, now at a competitor. "Everyone talks about what you built like it's legend. You're the blueprint." I didn't respond, not because I was above it, but because I had nothing to add. Let the work speak, let the absence echo. One afternoon in Boston, I passed by the old Lunaris headquarters. I hadn't been back in months. From the outside, it looked unchanged. Same brushed metal signage, same glass facade that once reflected ambition and now felt oddly hollow. I didn't go in, I didn't need to. That chapter wasn't home anymore, it was reference material. Rachel and I met for drinks the following Friday. She laughed when she told me that Ashley was now attending executive coaching sessions. Apparently, the board suggested it as part of her growth path. Translation, they're watching her now? I didn't comment. There was nothing left to say. My final contract with Lunaris ended cleanly, no extensions. They asked if I'd consider staying on retainer. I declined. There's a difference between being needed and being used. I had no interest in blurring that line. Later that month, I gave a keynote at a closed-door retreat for healthcare founders. No slides, no sound bites. I simply told them how infrastructure fails when you confuse visibility with value. When I finished, the room was quiet, in the way people get when they've been told something they already knew but had forgotten how to say. After the talk, someone approached me and said, "You made it sound easy." I smiled. "It's not, but it is clear." That night, I sat in my office with the lights low, reviewing a list of prospective clients. I paused at the top of the document and wrote one sentence across the margin. I was never the dead weight. I was the foundation. And now everyone finally knew it.